Welcome to History Captured. We document what history tried to erase. Subscribe.
In the middle of the war, in 1942, at a rear military camp far from the front line, a decision was made that never appeared in official combat reports. From several infantry units, a group of soldiers was selected. They were not volunteers. They were not informed of any special mission. According to unit records, they remained active servicemen assigned to routine duties. In reality, they were marked for participation in a closed military experiment approved at a higher level. At the time, these soldiers believed they were being reassigned temporarily. None of them were told that this transfer would be the last official record of their service. The approval for the experiment came from officers responsible for rear operations and military medicine. The project was discussed behind closed doors and classified as a necessary wartime measure. Its purpose was defined clearly: to test how soldiers would endure extreme physical and psychological stress. Local commanders were not briefed on the full scope of the operation. They were ordered to transfer selected men without explanation and without creating additional paperwork. Responsibility was deliberately divided among several departments. This ensured that no single official could later be held accountable. Before the transfer, the soldiers underwent a medical inspection. The examination was not meant to confirm fitness for combat. It was used to assess endurance, physical tolerance, and the ability to follow orders without resistance. Those who failed the criteria were quietly returned to their units. Those who passed were removed from standard personnel lists. From this moment, their status changed. They were no longer tracked through ordinary military records. The transfer was carried out under guard and usually at night. No destination was provided. No correspondence was allowed. Personal belongings were limited to the minimum. From this point on, all information about the soldier's location was classified. Even internal military reports referred to the transfer only in general terms. For administrative purposes, their absence was explained as a temporary redeployment. In practice, their trail was already being erased. Within weeks, the soldiers' names stopped appearing in unit logs. Their bunks were reassigned. Their personal files were sealed or removed. Mail addressed to them was returned unanswered. Officially, they were later listed as missing during wartime operations. No details were provided. The experiment continued. The soldiers did not return. By late 1942, the selected soldiers were delivered to an isolated military facility located far from civilian areas and transport routes. The site did not appear on standard military maps. Access was restricted, and movement was controlled by armed guards. According to surviving records, the facility operated under the authority of a special wartime commission combining military command and medical staff. The soldiers were informed that they were participating in a classified endurance program necessary for the war effort. No timelines were given. No explanation of risks was provided. From this point forward, the experiment officially began. The first phase focused on physical stress. Soldiers were subjected to prolonged exposure to cold, exhaustion, sleep deprivation, and restricted nutrition. Daily routines were altered without explanation. Medical staff recorded reactions without intervention. Collapse, confusion, and loss of coordination were documented as expected outcomes. Participants were not permitted to withdraw. Refusal was treated as insubordination. The purpose was not recovery. It was measurement. The second phase introduced psychological pressure. Isolation, sensory deprivation, and repeated interrogations were used to study mental breakdown under controlled conditions. According to internal notes, emotional responses were classified and timed. Fear, apathy, aggression, and dissociation were treated as data points. The soldiers were no longer addressed by name. They were referred to by numbers. At this stage, several participants showed irreversible psychological damage. As the experiment progressed, casualties increased. Medical reports described severe exhaustion, neurological symptoms, and loss of basic motor functions. Some soldiers were removed from active testing. Their subsequent fate is not documented in surviving records. Internal correspondence refers to these cases as operational losses. No deaths were officially recorded at the facility. The absence of data suggests deliberate removal. By early 1943, the experiment was abruptly terminated. The facility was closed. Personnel were reassigned. Equipment was removed. No final report was issued. In subsequent military records, the participating soldiers were listed as missing during wartime operations. No investigation followed. No burial sites were recorded. The experiment ended. The evidence was erased. After the facility was closed in early 1943, the administrative phase began. Personnel files related to the experiment were pulled from standard archives. Some folders were sealed under special classification. Others were quietly removed. Clerks were instructed to update unit records without adding explanations. Names were struck out. Dates were left incomplete. From that moment, the soldiers ceased to exist as individuals in the paperwork. They became an accounting problem to be resolved. Internally, the outcome of the experiment was assessed as unsatisfactory. Reports indicated high loss rates and unstable results. The data could not be reliably applied to field operations. Rather than revise the program, Command chose termination. The experiment was labeled a closed wartime initiative. Discussion of responsibility was avoided. No disciplinary actions followed. Unit registries were quietly amended. Where names once appeared, new annotations were added. Most used the same wording: missing during wartime operations. No locations were specified, no circumstances described, no witnesses listed. This phrasing allowed the military to close cases without further inquiry. It was a familiar formula, used whenever explanation was inconvenient. Families began writing letters. They asked about transfers, about delays in correspondence, about sudden silence. Responses, when sent, contained no information. Standard phrases replaced answers. In many cases, families were informed months later that the soldier was missing. No further contact was permitted. The remaining documentation was sealed. Access was restricted to a narrow circle of officials. Review dates were postponed indefinitely. Over time, parts of the archive were lost, damaged, or destroyed. What survived remained fragmented. What did not survive was the full account of what happened to the soldiers. In February 1943, at a military rail junction far from the front, a transport operation was carried out under strict secrecy. A small group of soldiers was loaded into sealed freight rail cars, normally used for equipment. The transfer was not logged as a troop movement. According to surviving transport schedules, the train was rerouted multiple times and disappeared from standard military tracking. The soldiers were not informed of their destination. They were told only that the journey was part of a classified assignment. This was the last confirmed record placing them alive within the military system. The train's destination was an underground medical facility constructed into natural terrain. Built before the war and expanded during it, the site was designed to operate independently for months. It did not appear on civilian or standard military maps. According to internal engineering records, the facility was assigned to experimental medical programs. Its isolation allowed operations to continue without external oversight. The soldiers brought there were officially reclassified as non-deployable personnel. Their legal status effectively changed overnight. Inside the facility, soldiers were no longer identified by name. Medical logs replaced names with numerical codes. Timestamps recorded reactions, not individuals. Entries describe loss of orientation, delayed motor responses, and memory failure after prolonged exposure to experimental conditions. In several cases, notes end abruptly without conclusions. No discharge records follow. This suggests the subjects were removed from the program without formal documentation. By mid-1943, the volume of internal documentation became a liability. Operational notes referred to the disposal of materials no longer required for analysis. The wording avoids direct references. Archival correspondence confirms that parts of the documentation were destroyed on site. What was removed was not equipment. It was evidence. After the war, several internal commissions attempted to reconstruct the fate of missing personnel. In multiple cases, references led to sealed archives or missing files. Witnesses were unavailable or reassigned. One internal summary concluded that the losses could not be traced to combat activity. The case was closed without resolution. The soldiers remained officially missing. The experiment remained officially non-existent. In the spring of 1943, several surviving soldiers were moved again, this time at night. No records explain why the transfer took place or where they were taken. The movement was carried out under blackout conditions, away from settlements and main roads. According to later testimonies, guards were instructed not to speak and not to answer questions. This transfer does not appear in any official transport logs. It exists only through fragments and indirect references. For some of the soldiers, this was the last time they were seen by anyone outside the facility. Later inspections of the surrounding area revealed several unmarked burial sites. No names, no dates, no unit identifiers. Military engineers classified the locations as temporary wartime ground disturbances. No exhumation was ordered. There is no documentation linking these sites directly to the experiment, but the timing and proximity raised internal concerns that were never formally addressed. Years later, one former medical orderly provided a brief testimony during an internal review. He stated that several soldiers did not die during testing, but afterward, when their condition made further observation useless. According to his words, orders were clear. No reports, no names, no follow-up. The testimony was recorded, classified, and never referenced again. The witness was transferred shortly afterward and disappeared from subsequent records. After the war, the area surrounding the facility was declared restricted. Civilian access was prohibited. Maps were altered. Roads were removed. The zone remained closed long after any military activity officially ended. No public explanation was ever provided. The last reference to the experiment appears as a single line in a post-war summary. No description, no outcome, no names. Only a note stating that the matter was considered closed due to wartime necessity. What happened to the soldiers was never officially determined. They were erased quietly, without records, without graves, and without acknowledgement. In March 1942, military records briefly mention the formation of a special group within an infantry regiment stationed far from the front. The group was not given a designation, it was not assigned a number, and it was not listed as a separate unit. According to internal notes, the soldiers were selected for participation in a classified experimental program related to combat endurance. Their names appear once in the documentation. After that, never again. The experiment was conducted outside of combat. The soldiers were deliberately exposed to extreme environmental conditions for extended periods of time. Cold, exhaustion, sleep deprivation. Reports indicate that the purpose was to determine how long a soldier could remain functional without rest or medical intervention. No protective measures were documented. The conditions were described as acceptable losses under wartime necessity. Medical personnel were present throughout the experiment, but not to provide treatment. Their role was observation. Physiological responses were recorded at fixed intervals. Loss of coordination, delayed reactions, cognitive impairment. When a subject became unfit for further testing, the observation ended. What happened afterward is not described in the surviving documentation. By late 1942, internal correspondence indicates that the experiment was terminated. The stated reason was operational inefficiency. The results were described as inconsistent and difficult to apply to active combat units. No mention was made of the soldiers involved. The experiment was closed. The personnel were removed from further consideration. In the final personnel records, the soldiers from the experimental group were given a single status: missing during wartime operations. No location, no date, no explanation. There is no evidence they were ever deployed to the front. Their only confirmed assignment was the experiment. After that, the record ends. In August 1943, a similar procedure was repeated at a different rear military location, hundreds of kilometers from the original site. Archival unit logs confirm that a new group of soldiers was withdrawn from active training without formal explanation. As before, the selection was carried out quietly, under the supervision of medical officers and representatives of the Rear Command. The soldiers were reassigned to a special program, referenced only once in the documentation. No operational objectives were recorded. This repetition indicates that the experiment was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader wartime testing strategy. Later analysis of surviving materials revealed a geographic pattern. All known experimental sites were located deep in rear areas, far from active combat zones and civilian oversight. These locations were chosen for accessibility, isolation, and the ability to operate without interruption. None of the sites appear in post-war public military maps. Several were officially reclassified as training areas that never hosted permanent personnel. The absence of these locations from official records suggests deliberate removal rather than accidental loss. In early 1944, a closed medical review summarized the results of the experimental program. The conclusion stated that the human limits observed during testing were significantly lower than projected. Extended exposure led to rapid physical collapse and irreversible cognitive impairment. The findings were labeled unsuitable for frontline application. Rather than publishing or revising the methodology, the Commission recommended full termination and archival sealing. Following the medical review, an administrative order was issued to close the program. The directive instructed responsible departments to finalize records and remove all references to the experimental groups from active files. No guidance was provided regarding the disposition of participating soldiers. Their status was resolved internally, without documentation accessible to standard military registries. The closure was executed within weeks.
When historians later examined wartime personnel statistics, they identified a discrepancy. For several rear units, casualty numbers and transfer records did not align with known deployments or operations. The missing figures corresponded to the time frame of the experimental programs. No official explanation was ever provided. The gap remains visible in the archives, not as evidence of loss, but as evidence of removal. In late 1942, a classified aviation program began testing human survival at extreme altitude without combat involvement. The experiments were conducted at a rear research facility linked to military aviation medicine. Selected soldiers were placed inside pressure chambers designed to simulate conditions far above operational flight ceilings. According to internal notes, the objective was to determine the precise point at which consciousness, coordination, and cardiac function failed. Several test sessions ended prematurely after subjects lost awareness. Medical intervention was delayed to observe natural recovery limits. The program produced data used to refine aircraft performance charts, while the human cost remained absent from official summaries. In early 1943, naval medical units conducted immersion tests to measure survival time in freezing water. The soldiers involved were not sailors lost at sea, but personnel assigned specifically for controlled exposure. Subjects were submerged repeatedly, sometimes multiple times in a single day. Body temperature, pulse, and motor response were recorded until failure. Internal correspondence indicates that several participants did not regain full motor control after extraction. The results were incorporated into naval survival manuals. The individual outcomes were not preserved. Parallel to environmental testing, chemical stress trials were conducted on selected personnel. The substances used were described as non-lethal irritants, intended to study reaction time, disorientation, and recovery speed. Doses were increased incrementally during repeated sessions. Long-term effects were not the focus of the program. Several reports mentioned delayed neurological symptoms appearing days after exposure. These cases were transferred to separate medical files and excluded from experimental summaries. By mid-1943, The experiments expanded into psychological endurance testing. Soldiers were placed in isolated rooms for extended periods, without time reference, sound, or external stimuli. According to monitoring logs, the objective was to track cognitive breakdown under controlled deprivation. Subjects reported hallucinations, memory fragmentation, and loss of self-orientation. Testing concluded once coherent responses ceased. The findings were classified and integrated into interrogation and training doctrine. In early 1944, a closed commission reviewed the accumulated data from multiple experimental programs. The conclusion stated that human limits under extreme conditions were measurable, predictable, and exploitable. The report emphasized that such testing could not be conducted under normal military regulations. It recommended continued use of classified experimental frameworks during wartime necessity. The document was approved, sealed, and removed from standard archival access. In mid-1943, a classified medical program was launched to measure the limits of pain tolerance in active soldiers. The testing was conducted under controlled conditions at a rear military medical facility. Subjects were restrained and exposed to increasing levels of physical stress designed to trigger pain responses without causing immediate injury. According to internal summaries, the purpose was to determine at what point pain impaired obedience, motor function, and decision-making. Medical staff were instructed not to intervene until predefined thresholds were reached. The results were compiled into reference tables used for training and interrogation protocols. The soldiers who participated were never reassigned to combat units. At the same time, parallel trials were conducted to study battlefield performance under simulated injury conditions. The program focused on how soldiers continued to function after controlled trauma, blood loss, and shock induction. Medical reports note that injuries were calibrated to avoid immediate fatal outcomes while producing realistic physiological stress. Subjects were ordered to perform basic tasks following exposure. Failure rates were logged. Recovery was not the primary concern. The findings were integrated into casualty handling doctrine and frontline manpower calculations. By late 1943, experiments began combining multiple stress factors simultaneously. Subjects were exposed to cold, exhaustion, restraint, and pain within a single testing cycle. The objective was to identify the point at which layered stress caused irreversible breakdown. Internal documents describe this phase as high-value data acquisition. Several participants failed to recover baseline function after testing. Their cases were classified as non-reportable losses. Concerns were raised internally regarding the legality of continued testing. A senior review concluded that ethical constraints were incompatible with wartime requirements. The program was granted an override status, allowing it to operate outside standard military and medical regulations. This authorization was signed at command level and distributed verbally. No formal ethical review documents exist in surviving archives. The final assessment concluded that human endurance could be quantified and manipulated under controlled conditions. The report stated that such knowledge provided a measurable strategic advantage. It also noted that disclosure of methods would be unacceptable under any circumstances. The findings were classified at the highest level. The experiment did not fail. It simply became too dangerous to acknowledge. In early 1943, a rear military research unit began controlled hypoxia trials on active soldiers. The tests were designed to simulate oxygen deprivation without direct combat involvement. Participants were placed in sealed environments where air supply was gradually reduced. According to internal notes, the objective was to determine the precise duration a soldier could remain operational while experiencing progressive oxygen loss. The trials were halted only after loss of consciousness occurred. Recovery time was recorded. Long-term effects were not tracked. The data was forwarded to command under a general heading of Operational Resilience. Later that year, a separate program focused on prolonged nutritional deprivation. Soldiers were placed on restricted rations for extended periods under controlled conditions. Caloric intake was reduced incrementally, while physical activity remained constant. Medical logs indicate that the program aimed to calculate the minimum nutritional threshold required to sustain combat readiness. Participants exhibited rapid weight loss, cognitive slowing, and loss of coordination. The experiment concluded once task performance dropped below predefined limits. By mid-1944, attention shifted to sleep suppression. Selected soldiers were kept awake for prolonged periods under continuous observation. Artificial lighting was maintained at all times. The purpose was to measure degradation of judgment, obedience, and reaction time in the absence of sleep. Internal reports note hallucinations, disorientation, and memory failure after several days. Testing continued until subjects could no longer follow basic instructions. In the final phase, multiple deprivation methods were applied simultaneously. Sleep restriction, limited nutrition, and oxygen control were combined into a single testing cycle. The objective was to identify failure points under compounded stress rather than isolated factors. Internal assessments described the results as predictable but operationally useful. Several participants did not recover baseline cognitive function after completion. Their cases were reassigned and excluded from further analysis. By late 1944, the accumulated experimental data was integrated into strategic planning. The findings influenced training schedules, ration standards, and operational tempo calculations. The experiments were no longer referenced individually. They were absorbed into doctrine. No mention was made of the soldiers who generated the data. Their contribution existed only in the margins of operational effectiveness. In early 1944, a new experimental phase was officially described as a rehabilitation program for exhausted personnel. According to internal directives, soldiers transferred into this program were not considered wounded or unfit. They were classified as temporarily non-operational. The stated goal was to restore combat effectiveness through controlled exposure to stress, fatigue, and isolation. In practice, the program continued many of the same experimental methods under a different designation. The change in terminology allowed the activity to proceed without triggering medical or legal review. Within the rehabilitation framework, behavioral conditioning was introduced. Soldiers were subjected to repetitive commands, enforced stillness, and timed response drills under fatigue. The objective was to measure obedience after prolonged stress exposure. Reports indicate that reaction delays and emotional flattening were considered desirable outcomes. Subjects who complied without hesitation were marked as stabilized. Those who resisted were retained for further sessions. Another component focused on cognitive suppression. Soldiers were required to perform basic mental tasks after prolonged fatigue, limited nutrition, and sleep restriction. The evaluation did not measure accuracy alone. It measured compliance under confusion. Internal notes describe reduced independent reasoning as operationally beneficial. Once cognitive initiative declined below a set threshold, the subject was considered conditioned. By late 1944, a separate classification was introduced for program participants. They were designated as unsuitable for return to frontline units. The justification cited psychological instability and reduced initiative. In reality, the classification prevented external medical evaluation. Once assigned this status, soldiers were transferred out of standard personnel accounting. Their future assignments were handled through closed administrative channels. The final stage did not involve discharge or trial. Former participants were reassigned to non-combat labor roles within the military system. They were absorbed into logistics, maintenance, and support functions, where individual records were rarely reviewed. This ensured the experiment left no visible trace within combat statistics. The soldiers remained alive, but they were removed from history. In late 1943, a classified medical program began testing how soldiers functioned after controlled, non-lethal injuries. The injuries were intentionally induced to replicate battlefield trauma without immediate fatal risk. The purpose was not treatment, but observation. Subjects were ordered to perform basic tasks after injury, including standing, walking, and responding to commands. Medical reports focused on compliance, reaction speed, and decision-making under pain. Once the required data was obtained, testing stopped. Recovery outcomes were not tracked within the program. At the same time, tolerance to blood loss was studied under controlled conditions. The objective was to determine how much blood loss a soldier could sustain while remaining operational. Extraction volumes were increased gradually over multiple sessions. Vital signs were monitored, but intervention thresholds were deliberately delayed. Internal correspondence states that several subjects experienced permanent physiological impairment. These cases were transferred out of experimental accounting and reclassified. Another series of tests focused on chemical suppression of pain. Substances described as temporary analgesics were administered before and after induced injury. The program aimed to determine whether chemically dulled pain increased obedience and task completion. Reports note delayed reactions, reduced emotional response, and impaired judgment. Long-term neurological effects were recorded separately and excluded from main findings. Participants were removed from testing once their condition no longer produced usable data. Internal notes describe subjects as no longer operationally informative. This designation did not imply death or recovery. It meant the experiment had extracted all measurable value. After reassignment, these soldiers no longer appeared in medical or operational summaries. Their outcome was resolved administratively. The final directive governing these programs included a silence clause. Personnel involved were prohibited from documenting methods, outcomes, or participant identities. The clause remained in effect after the war under the same classification level. As a result, no direct testimony from these experiments entered public record. What survives today exists only indirectly, through inconsistencies, gaps, and unexplained data.